I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. Glad to have you here for another lecture in our Brookings Mountain West lecture series. We're very glad to have Tom Wright back. We had Tom here about a year and a half ago, just before the 2012 elections, and he gave us some of his thoughts on what was then the changing global order, and he's back to correct all of those thoughts today. No, he's not. He's going to elaborate on what has or hasn't happened since then as the United States tries to find its role in a changing global order. Tom, like all our visiting scholars, has been in UNLV classes and meeting with faculty and students, as well as people in the community. I know you'll enjoy his talk tonight. We should have time for some questions at the end. And Tom's uniquely qualified to speak on this topic. His academic credentials include his undergraduate degrees from University College Dublin, his doctorate from Georgetown, as well as fellowships at Harvard and I forget, Princeton, among his other academic experiences. But he's here tonight to try and make sense of a very confusing world these days. Tom?
Thank you, Bill, for that kind introduction. And thank you for your hospitality in bringing me back down to UNLV. It's a great pleasure to be here, and not just because of the weather differences that I'm sure everyone mentions, but it's a real pleasure to be back here at UNLV and in Las Vegas. And I was here about 18 months ago, and at that stage I was competing with the first presidential debate as the alternative entertainment that evening, and this evening I understand I'm competing with a basketball game. So if I'm down again, I eagerly await what the next rival programming will be. But it's been a great week so far. I've enjoyed meeting students here and teaching today and yesterday. What I want to talk to you about this evening is related to what I spoke about the last time, but there's been a lot of new developments. One of the risks of giving a talk when you've spoken before, particularly if it's on camera, is somebody can go back and check everything that I said and say, oh, you know, you said that, but now you've completely changed your tune. I'm grateful and thankful that the events that have happened, I think, over the last couple of years have just put into sharper relief, I think, some of the themes that I will talk about this evening, because we gather here at a time when there's very disturbing pictures on the news from Ukraine. There's John Kerry's in Asia trying to dampen down tensions between China and Japan. In the Middle East, the region just seems like it's in complete free fall, and very few people in Washington or in the region or anywhere else have any idea of where it's headed or what the future equilibrium or order there will look like. And I think this is part of a larger story that we've seen unfold in world politics since the financial crisis in 2008, not directly linked to the crisis, but it's happened just coincidentally since then, partly because of what that meant for American power, but also, I think, to do with some longer term trends about the rise of China and just the path that geopolitics have taken. But before I look ahead, I'd like to look back for a short while at, I think, what we now sort of look at the period from 1991 to 2008, because that period was one of great power peace and generally very positive great power relations. The United States, China, Japan, and Russia and others did not always see eye to eye. Indeed, they had differences over how to handle particular crises. On occasion, there were isolated crises between them, between the United States and China in 2001, when a US spy plane went down on Hainan Island, and in 1999, when Russian forces took the Kosovo airport, and General Wesley Clark contemplated attacking the Russian forces but was dissuaded by a British general. But by and large, these were isolated incidents. They were generally resolved quickly and without much fanfare. They weren't really at the scale of what we would normally think of as an international crisis. And foreign policy scholars have come up with a couple of explanations for this period of great power peace. The first is that the United States was so far ahead of other countries that potential competitors had no real opportunity to challenge the status quo. Russia may be fuming about the US attack on Serbia, and China might have privately coveted some of the island territories that it's now laying claim to, but they had no strategy to directly confront Washington. The gap in military power is simply too large for them to bridge the gap. Dartmouth professor Bill Wolfert has called this the stability of a unipolar world, and he wrote that it had two highly desirable effects, at least from the US point of view. The first is that it meant that other great powers would not directly challenge the United States, and the second was that it minimized great power competition or security tensions between other countries. So other countries wouldn't really be rivals with each other because they were worried about the US intervening and sort of dampening down the security competition. But that was only half the story, though. If it was just about unipolarity, and if the US was behaving in a way that others found inherently objectionable, then Europe and Japan could join others to balance against the United States. And then the US advantage would have eroded very quickly. The US power relies not primarily on its military power, but as importantly on the fact that most other countries believe that their interests are served by the US-led international order. Indeed, China, India, Brazil, and other countries that are largely outside of the order wanted to become a part of it. They wanted to join the existing order because it offered them the best path to prosperity. China, for one country, has grown incredibly wealthy, wealthier than it used to be, and brought millions and millions of people out of poverty and established itself on the world stage in a period of globalization and unipolarity. Why? Because this system is quite open and provides opportunities. The first person to recognize the potential for this dynamic was actually Frank Fukuyama in his essay that became very instantly famous and controversial, The End of History and the Last Man. That's an essay that is, and a book that has been criticized primarily for its title rather than for the substance of some of his argument, because it's such a controversial title. But he really, in that book, captured the removal of ideological competition from world politics and showing that there was very few viable or no other viable pathways to modernity for other countries at that particular point in time because of the collapse of communism. That liberal democracy and market democracy was the only show in town. Not everyone would go completely all the way in that direction, particularly on democracy, but they would very much embrace the market economy and globalization. They'd gravitate toward that for self-interest, not because they wanted to be friendly with the United States or they wanted to serve American interests, because it worked for them. Sometimes they would set aside, as in China, the democracy case, but they would move ahead on the economic front. Although many critics seized on the September 11th attacks and other developments to criticize Fukuyama, much of his prediction bore fruit. As Princeton professor John Eikenberry put it, the struggle over international order today is not about fundamental principles. China and other emerging great powers do not want to contest the basic rules and principles of the liberal international order. They just wish to gain more authority and leadership within it. So it's not really a battle, according to Eikenberry, about the very rules of the game. It's a battle about who gets to sit at the board table and try to, try to have a say in the writing of the rules. Some scholars said that the period of great power peace, that period of relative cooperation from 1991 to 2008, seemed analogous to the concert of Europe. We often hear people talk about the concert of Europe or the concert of great powers as a model for the future, but maybe, as Dan Nexon of Georgetown argued, we are already living in a concert system, albeit one deeply infected by American primacy. He says that the argument that we're not is based on a flawed description of the old concert of Europe. The concert then did not prevent deep disagreements between its members. The powers sometimes acted without consensus. Sometimes they even fought limited wars. But they did act as a kind of what he calls a geostrategic cartel to basically run the international system. They agreed on some of the fundamental principles, and they didn't sort of directly challenge each other's sphere of influence. This is more than just an academic debate. It really has influenced American strategic thinking since the Cold War. Beginning in the 1990s, American leaders began to downplay the differences between the major powers, and they began to talk up the common strategic challenges that they all faced, including terrorism, nuclear proliferation, mass atrocities, and preventing mass atrocities and human rights, and managing the global economy and combating climate change, and the need to tackle those challenges together. President George W. Bush is remembered mainly for the war on terrorism and for his attempt to try to democratize the Middle East, which obviously did not work out as he intended. But in retrospect, his belief in a great power concert system is at least as striking. There was a couple of speeches in a major strategy document where he makes this explicit. In a major speech in 2002 at West Point, he said, really echoing the unipolarity narrative, he said, "America has and intends to keep military strength beyond challenge, thereby making the destabilizing arms race of other eras pointless and limiting rivalries to trade and other pursuits of peace." So here Bush is saying that he wants American military power to be so dominant, not to impose America's will in other countries, but so the normal geopolitical game of competing against each other will be pointless. That countries will just give up that ghost and would focus on more productive avenues for their ambition. It was a very sort of radical statement. He was saying that the US could permanently banish great power security competition as long as it was militarily powerful. But he also believed that the great power peace was rooted in common interests. His first national security strategy stated, "Today, the international community has the best chance since the rise of the nation state in the 17th century to build a world where great powers compete in peace instead of continually prepare for war. Today, the great powers find ourselves on the same side, united by the common dangers of terrorist violence and chaos." He goes on to say that Russia is in the midst of a hopeful transition, reaching for its democratic future and a partner in the war on terrorism. Chinese leaders are discovering that economic freedom is the only source of national wealth. In time, they will find that social and political freedom is a source of national greatness. So here Bush is saying, just as the Concert of Europe leaders talked about the common threat of revolution, and that bound them together, they came together to prevent a return to the era of French Revolution, that he's saying that the common threat of terrorism meant that great powers could put aside those other differences to confront a common foe. We saw that also then with Bob Zelek's famous speech on China being a responsible stakeholder in the international system, very much echoing Eikenberry that China would work to sustain the current international order as a partner. And this was continued in many ways by the Obama administration that emphasized, particularly in its early years, on the common challenges and the need for what Hillary Clinton then called a multi-partner rather than a multipolar world, that the great powers had interests in common and would work together. What has happened, however, since 2008, 2009, really goes against many of these core strategic assumptions. The change has been fairly profound. The world's second and third largest economies, China and Japan, are in tension with each other, and the risk of conflict is no longer unthinkable. I don't think it's particularly likely or probable in the immediate future, but it certainly hovers in the background. It looms large, and it's very much a factor on the strategic planning in both countries. US-China relations have become much more difficult as China has begun to assert itself in its neighborhood, particularly at sea, and there are tensions between China and its neighbors in Southeast Asia. These developments are not limited to East Asia. In the Middle East, the Arab awakening, which first began with such hope, has since led to what looks like to many people like the collapse or the unraveling of regional order in the Middle East, and a real concern that we are seeing the emergence of a sectarian Cold War or conflict between Sunni and Shia Islam, which would reshape the region for many years to come, with other challenges like Iran also being present. And in Europe, which I think is where these developments are much less pronounced, thankfully, than elsewhere, we still see Russia competing with the United States and the EU for influence in Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and Armenia, amongst other places. And this obviously is playing out on our screens in a very dramatic way in Ukraine, where the people of Ukraine wanted to sign a partnership agreement, or many people in Ukraine wanted to sign a partnership agreement with the European Union. Russian pressure meant that the Ukrainian government did not, and in the protests that followed, obviously they've ended in the tragic events of this week, and we remain to see where that situation is headed. Now, some historians have used and some analysts have used the uptick in geopolitical tensions to say that the world is on the brink of a 1914 style crisis. For instance, the historian Margaret Macmillan has written that we are witnessing, as much as the world of 1914, shifts in the international power structure, with emerging powers challenging the established ones. Just as national rivalries led to mutual suspicions between Britain and the newly ascendant Germany before 1914, the same is happening now between China and the United States, and also between China and Japan. But while this analogy is somewhat tempting, particularly on the centenary of World War I, which is one of the reasons why it's so prevalent in the discussion, it also is somewhat unhelpful and misleading. There are many differences with 1914. For one, there's a US alliance system that did not exist then. While 1914 was also interdependent, interdependence today is of a very different quality than the interdependence then. But I think most significantly for me is that in 1914 came on the back of a couple of decades of very serious competition between the major powers in Europe. Today we are just beginning that period. If there is a historic analogy to be made, maybe the world today looks a little bit more like 1891 after Bismarck died, or even 1871 after the First Franco-Prussian War. In other words, it's the beginning of a period that could lead to a major crisis in the future, rather than having a crisis actually be imminently appearing on the horizon. So there are reasons to be concerned, but this is a very long-term game that will unfold in front of us. So what I'd like to do is to talk briefly about why this is happening. What are some of the reasons behind this increase in security competition between major states? And the first is the rise of China, which I think is driving a lot of this, particularly in Asia. The logic here is pretty straightforward. Ever since the Peloponnesian War, we've talked about how the rise of a new power can lead to uncertainty and threaten other countries, and that the fears that it would arise elsewhere, and the increasing ambition that the rising power would have means that we could see a great power war. We have seen this many times before with the rise of Germany in the 19th century, the rise of Japan and the Soviet Union in the 20th century. And even if both the dominant power and the rising power don't actually harbour hostile intentions towards each other, there's always the risk of a security dilemma where they get involved in security competition because they are engaging in defensive measures which are misinterpreted. In recent times, there's only been one major sort of power transition between two countries that's been relatively harmonious, and that, of course, is between Britain and the United States at the end of World War II. Most others have had serious problems and have ended usually in conflict. Although this time may be different. The international order today is not as threatening to China as maybe the international order of the past was to rising powers. Nuclear weapons means that countries are more secure than they used to be. And China's ambition seems to be of a slightly different order. China, as many people have pointed out, does not want a new global order. They don't have a 10-point plan that they want to put into place to transform international politics. However, they do seem to want more influence in their region. They want to have a system that is organized more around their preferences and interests than organized around America's preferences and interests, at least in East Asia. Taken to its logical conclusion over the long term, perhaps what they would like to see is a form of a tributary sort of system where they have a veto power influence over major developments in other countries, although that is not apparent quite yet, but it is something that you hear in the region of concern about Chinese grand strategy. So that's the first, I think, driver of this development. The second are the anxieties in other countries that arise out of China's rise. We've seen increased sort of nationalism in Japan and elsewhere as countries begin to balance against China, creating most of the time very legitimately sort of balancing against China, but also it can greatly complicate regional cooperation. The increased sort of nationalism throughout the region, including China, can lead to dangerous sort of involvement of domestic constituencies over territorial disputes and other issues where it's hard for governments and leaders to back down in a crisis. It's hard for them to compromise because they have to worry if they live in a democracy about the next election, or if they live in China or another authoritarian state, they worry about a populist uprising or an erosion of their legitimacy. This is not confined just to China and its neighbors, or China and the United States. We've seen over the last 12 months that two of America's closest allies are barely on speaking terms with each other, South Korea, of course, and Japan. There's no risk of a conflict between South Korea and Japan, but it's incredibly important from the US perspective for those two countries to work closely together to tackle common challenges like the North Korean nuclear program and maritime issues. But as of yet, the President of South Korea and the Prime Minister of Japan have not spoken to each other or visited each other since taking office because of the South Korean objection to the way in which Prime Minister Abe has handled some of the historical issues and problems in Japanese history, including most notably his visit to Yasukuni Shrine in December, which was a surprise here in the United States because he gave the impression that he would not visit the shrine and aroused considerable passions and anger in Northeast Asia. The third reason, which is also Asia-focused reason, is that we have territorial disputes in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea, and also on land, although we haven't heard as much about them as of yet, that are flashpoints. These are areas that have long been contested, but countries have not really asserted their claims in the way that they are doing now. So these are emerging as real sort of potential crisis points. The Senkaku Daiwa Islands in the East China Sea, which are under Japanese administrative control, but are claimed by China, by Taiwan, and by Japan. And that's where we see a lot of the problems sort of arising in terms of the Chinese Air Defense Identification Zone that was declared in November, and the various clashes or rivalry between the fishing vessel fleets near the islands. Before World War II, the Sudetenland, the Danzig Corridor, Alsace-Lorraine, these were the territorial disputes in Europe that really created many of the sort of flashpoints or problems. And so those, thankfully, are not really present in Europe today. Europe's borders are very much settled, but they are present in East Asia. The fourth reason is the perceived decline of the West and of the United States. And this is an issue that is in much dispute. Many people, including myself, do not believe that the United States is in decline. But around the world, the perception is that the US is in decline, or at least is less capable of sustaining the international order than it used to be. even if the capabilities are not in doubt, sometimes the will of the United States and the American people to continue to play the role that they have played since World War II is seen in doubt. There is concern about the dysfunction in Washington, particularly, for instance, when the president had to cancel his trip to Asia in November because of or October because of the standoff, the budget standoff, and the risk of a default on the debt. So these questions about decline of the West or about withdrawal of the United States from the rest of the world create uncertainty. In the Middle East, it creates a vacuum that can be filled by others. In East Asia, it gives Chinese strategists a narrative that they can use, which is the US is not going to be here forever. They may be pulling back. Why are you so close to them? You should be closer to us. And so in that geopolitical game for influence, the perception of decline is a serious problem and may be a destabilizing force beyond whether or not it's in America, whether or not it's one thinks it's right or wrong that the US is engaged. There is a separate question about the consequences of a change in US posture. The fifth reason, and this is 5 of 6, I think, is in the Middle East, where we are really seeing a historic unraveling of regional order that we've only seen once since World War II, and that was in the case of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 and to 1991. And that occurred astonishingly at the time in a very orderly fashion and worked out relatively well. But generally speaking, when empires or orders collapse, they can be much less stable. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire was one of the stories behind the lead up to World War I. And this appears as if it's playing out in a way that we don't know where it's headed, but it will unfold over a 10-year or even longer period of time. Countries are going to try to hedge against this future and try to engage in new alliances and arrangements and new postures that could sort of threaten each other. And we see the sectarian divide emerge front and center that threatens to become a conflict throughout the region from Syria to Lebanon and down to Jordan, Egypt and Bahrain and maybe ultimately Saudi Arabia. The final reason I think is on technology. And here we've seen a lot about the role of cyber weapons and robotics and other forms of new conventional technologies. But what I would point to is that we have often looked at the US strategic advantage and raw military power. But what's really important is the ability of the United States to project that power into critical regions. And some of the technologies that have emerged recently, particularly on asymmetric capabilities to do with anti-access and aerial denial in the Pacific and also in the Persian Gulf, means that there are doubts about the ability of the US Navy to project power in the way that it once did, because ships are now threatened by anti-ship ballistic missiles. There are other forms of anti-access weapons. Cyber weapons are also obviously an asymmetric capability. So it may be that America's advantage of having these, the ability to project force may be blunted at a time of crisis, or at least to sow enough delay to cause serious problems. So these I think are the key drivers of the return of geopolitical competition. The two most important, I think, are the rise of China and the collapse of regional order in the Middle East. But there are other sort of contributing factors as well. And that begs the question of what all of this will look like. What are the key sort of factors to keep? What are the key considerations to keep in mind when we're trying to analyze the future of geopolitical competition and what it means for U.S. strategy? The first point, I think, is that this will be a much more nuanced form of challenge than the United States is used to. The US tried to avoid great power politics for about a century and a half, with mixed success. Obviously, it got involved in World War I and World War II, but generally reluctantly on both occasions. But since then, the US challenges have been, well, there's been 3 phases really. The first was the Cold War, which obviously had many different phases, but is treated as one sort of phase, whereas the United States against the Soviet bloc Those two coalitions were essentially independent of each other. They had very little to do with each other economically. They largely existed separately. They were vulnerable to each other, but they did not work together. They were not part of the same system. And there was a heavy ideological content to the competition. Although some people may say it was more to do with Russian imperialism than communism, the threat of communism was a very sort of dominant feature in US strategy from the late 1940s right up to the end of the Cold War. This is a very different proposition. And as I mentioned earlier, the United States and China are very much part of the same order, at least economically. They are critical trading partners and economic partners. China is the largest holder of US debt. The US controls the access that China needs to its energy resources. The two countries are very linked together technologically. So it is a form of interdependence, but also competition that we have not, that the United States has not seen before, although we can see instances of it in history, particularly in Europe. The second major difference is that this is a very nuanced sort of challenge. That if you look at in East Asia, countries don't want to choose between the United States and China. They very much need the United States and China to have a good sort of relationship, but at the same time, they want to be partners with the United States to balance against China. They are countries that have sort of very divergent paths. They have an economic relationship that is really organized around China and a security strategy that's really organized around the United States. And so the question is, how long can those continue? All countries in the region hope that they can continue indefinitely. But that does mean that for the United States, it's important to have a strategy that is less about trying to contain China, which is completely impractical and would be not desired by any of America's allies in the region, and more about trying to create the type of environment in which the rise of China can be accommodated in a way that does not threaten its neighbours or threaten the status quo. I think a third way in which is somewhat different is that we've seen this in the Scarborough Reef with the Philippines and in the Senkaku Islands with Japan, is that the type of revisionism and assertiveness we're seeing is very much below the threshold of what we're accustomed to in diplomatic history. So countries are not invading each other or using land forces, but they are engaged in a sort of competition below the threshold of normal, aggression. So we see these standoffs or these tensions at sea. We see sort of proxy wars, whether it's in Syria, hopefully not in Ukraine, although that may yet happen. So it's sort of a more sort of subtle form of revisionism. And finally, amidst all of this, there's still a very pressing need for cooperation because countries do face common challenges. They do have common interests on everything from the global economy to the environment. And so preserving that cooperation at a time of slightly increased tensions will be a particularly difficult challenge. So what should the United States do? What are the strategic sort of implications of this for the United States? I would argue that the United States needs a new or a slightly different East Asia strategy, a new Middle East strategy, and a global strategy. That we see a lot of these things occurring simultaneously, and it's important to tackle them simultaneously. On East Asia, many of the proposed strategies that the United States has before it are not really viable. I'll just mention three very quickly. The first that some would argue for is containment, just contain China the way the United States contained the Soviet Union. But that would not work for the reasons I mentioned earlier. The region does not want China to be contained. They're reliant on it economically. The United States probably could not contain China if it tried to do so. If it was able to do so, it would probably backfire and damage US interests because the US has an important need to cooperate with China on issues of mutual interest, and also as an economic partner, China is a vital part of the global economy. So containment is not particularly an option. Some people, such as Hugh White of the Lowy Institute in Sydney, have argued that we need to see a real concert of Asia, a concert of powers, that the United States and China should divide up Asia into different spheres of influence. And China will get some more influence in its near abroad, and the United States would have its alliances intact, possibly accepting Taiwan and maybe some of the countries in the South China, in Southeast Asia. But that sounds attractive. I mean, the idea of two countries cooperating to avoid tensions seems like something we should endorse. But in fact, it would probably be one of the most destabilizing events ever to occur since World War II. The idea of two major powers getting together to divide up the map is something that we more think of with Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt than in the modern world. That would have dangerous repercussions for American commitments elsewhere. Who could possibly trust the United States if it tore up its alliances or agreements with other powers and consign them to dominance or being in the sphere of another country that they did not want to be a part of? So that has major downsides. And the third is to sort of, to pull back, to wash one's hands of the region. Again, East Asia is just too important for the United States not to be directly involved. The current approach has many elements going for it, but it sort of falls a little short in that it's not clear what the overall objective is, and there are challenges about the pivot or rebalance to Asia, as the administration's been calling it. But I think the challenge here is to make the preservation of the order and the creation of a regional order that works even if China does not agree to it, but would work best and provide incentives for China to be a full partner, is the only way forward. But that must include progress not just in the military front, but also economically and politically, including on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is, I'm sure you all know, is in trouble in Congress at the moment. A second sort of set of issues, though, is about the Middle East, and I won't spend too much time on this because I'm coming toward the end of my time. But here, the big question is whether or not the United States can stay involved in the Middle East, or it can pull back. And one of the factors here is not just what's going on in the region; it's also about what's going on in the United States. The shale revolution and the changes in energy production in the United States raise the prospect that the United States will not be dependent upon Middle Eastern oil for the first time in a long time. Now, analysts have pointed out that that oil is obviously a commodity. The United States relies on international energy markets, and so it will continue to be price sensitive, even though it may be getting its oil mainly from North America. That is all true, but there is a question being raised about whether or not the United States needs to take on the full burden of providing maritime security in the Middle East at a time when it is less reliant on that and the countries in East Asia are more reliant upon it. And so that is a debate I think we are going to see over the next 5 years or so about whether or not the US has to be directly involved, particularly on propping up regimes in the Middle East that are undemocratic at a time where the US does not necessarily need their oil. Now, as against that, the downside of any sort of changing in the US posture in the region means that it would just exacerbate uncertainties and increase the vacuum that the region is currently experiencing. And we may see new sort of proxy wars, not just in Syria, but elsewhere, as various groups and countries compete to try to secure their interests. So can the real question here, which unfortunately I do not have an answer to, is whether or not the United States can just pursue a set of narrow interests in the Middle East that it focuses on, like the Iranian nuclear program and Israel's security and counterterrorism, and ignore the broader question of trying to shape or push the regional order in a certain direction, or if it needs a real regional vision of what the Middle East order looks like. That is a debate that is currently only beginning to get underway. President Obama made some remarks on this in an interview recently with the New Yorker, where he said that the regional equilibrium, as he called it, had imploded, and we would need to wait to see what the new equilibrium was. But that really begged the question about what the role of the United States would be in having a preference for what equilibrium that should be. The final sort of challenge, I think, one other thing in the Middle East, which is we often treat the Middle East and Asia as separate regions, and they are to some degree, but they are also joined at the hip. East Asia needs a healthy Middle East in order for it to evolve in a positive direction. So the idea that the United States can leave the Middle East and focus on East Asia ignores the fact that a successful East Asia strategy requires a successful Middle Eastern strategy. Finally, on the global strategy, there is a question about how to preserve and increase cooperation in all of these major global issues at a time when we have these two tremendous sort of changes in the Middle East and East Asia. How can the United States work with Europe together through the transatlantic partnership to try to influence events and the progress of Asia and of the Middle East? What is the role of emerging powers in the international order? The United States will need to develop a global vision for where the overall global order goes, even as it is focused on these two most problematic of regions. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for trying to make order of the complex global order. We do have time for a few questions if there are any. Would someone like, oh, please.
Yes, that was very good talk. And I noticed that you did hit upon the economic powers and the economic balance issues. And it's true that it's a global economy, although particularly in East Asia, it's highly unbalanced. We have a 4% 4% of GDP trade deficit with China. China runs a double-digit surplus with us. And and they're making a lot of deals around the world, economic deals. I mean, China is. They're going into Africa, they're going other places. Seems those economic development deals are highly tied to a loyalty or let's work with us. We're going to help you, but you need to really work with us. So they do seem to have, China seems to have a pretty strong economic power development sort of strategy, and ours, do you feel that way? And couldn't we take some more specific steps? Living wages, you mentioned healthy environment, but living wages, working toward balance. What do you?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I think it gets to one of the big issues right now, which is American economic diplomacy. The United States has recognized, I think, that you can't just have a military response for the rebalance, that you need to engage the region much more economically, and especially on trade, which has been largely sort of dormant since at the WTO sort of Doha round of talks. And so the key pillar of this has been the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the US has been negotiating with many countries in Asia. And that is largely stuck in Congress right now. The President needs Trade Promotion Authority to get a vote really on TPP. He probably needs Trade Promotion Authority to close the deal, because America's partners are not going to want to put their best offer on the table unless he shows that he can get it passed in Congress. But it's largely unpopular on the Democratic side of the Senate. Harry Reid, the senator from here, from Nevada, has come out against it. There's maybe reasons for that domestically, but in the region, there's deep concern that the US will not be able to deliver on this diplomatic objective. And so one of the questions, there was a report in the New York Times that at a meeting Vice President Biden had with members of Congress, it was said, we understand the geopolitical realities of why this is important to deal with sort of China and Asia, but we're more attuned to local sort of political realities of our constituencies. And so that, I think, is a big sort of question about whether or not the United States can continue to provide the type of economic sort of partnerships that it traditionally has and that China is now doing.
Sure.
In your remarks, you have not really touched on Western Europe or Russia, and particularly Your thoughts on Russia would be of interest to me, in as much as I look at a nation which is weakening, but is unwilling to recognize its diminished role. And that, plus what is the role of the rest of the common market, NATO, within this?
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating question. I mean, I think Putin is one of those sort of larger-than-life figures in world politics. I mean, if you look at everyone who's there as a leader now, the one who sort of stands out as a very sort of traditional, sort of strongman sort of leader who punches above their weight is probably, for usually for the worse, is probably Putin. And so the sort of short answer to why is, Russia more influential maybe than it should be, I think has a lot to do with leadership. It's because he's a very sort of canny player of the international game. And he's had a big test in Syria. We're about to see a big test, I think, in Ukraine. Unfortunately, I think most of the, if not all of the influence that he exerts is for the worse in terms of, the interests of the rest of the world. But he is very astute, I think, strategically. And I think that we will, I think if Russia was more powerful than it is, it will be creating a lot more problems than it has. I mean, one of the reasons why it has not been as, as destabilizing, as maybe, it has been in the past, I think is simply because it is somewhat constrained by its current sort of level of strength. But the intention, I think, is largely there. On Western Europe, the big question is whether or not Europe can get out of its economic crisis, or whether, having survived the initial storm, it's destined for a lost decade like Japan. And that, I think, is the big sort of question. Is it in for a prolonged stagnation, or can it get back on its feet and restore economic growth? I'm unfortunately pessimistic on the future of the EU. I think the EU will continue to exist, but I think it will face many, many, many internal problems that it will be consumed with. It will have a period of low growth and high unemployment in the periphery, and there will be big problems about how the EU will respond. But I hope I'm wrong about that, because it's more than just the future of Europe, and that depends on it. Europe has always played a very important role internationally as a partner of the United States, and so for it to continue to do that, it really needs to get back on its feet.
Was there, yes, sir.
Thank you again for your talk. I'm really more concerned about China and the way they're accumulating gold. They just bought the Chase Manhattan Bank in New York City with the largest underground vault in the world, and it's secured. They're producing gold that we don't know how much they're producing. They're buying gold all over the world, different. I think they're just going to get us from within, because they're using all the money that we're giving them for debt, and they're coming back and buying hard assets in America and around the world. I don't see us competing.
I mean, it's worth, I think, noting that, China is, with all the responsible stakeholder debate, I mean, I think China is a responsible stakeholder in the global economy. I mean, they have been a very sort of important part of the G20 response to the financial crisis. And there's a story that Hank Paulson tells in his memoir that early on in the crisis, the Chinese prime minister, I think, or vice prime minister, came up to him in Beijing and said that the Russians had contacted Beijing and asked them to work with them to try to take advantage of the crisis to dump a lot of treasuries to collapse the US economy, that this was actually a formal Russian government proposal, and the Chinese said no and then told the United States about it. Now, whether or not the actual story is true, I mean, the Russians deny that, of course, as they would, but I think it does show that, China really, really needs and wants a stable global economy for themselves. So I think that their interests and their actions are in the right place generally in the global economy. But I think the thing to watch is that they are now going through their own very severe economic difficulties. They have their own debt problem. They've accumulated debt at an extremely rapid pace. The overall debt may be somewhat manageable, but the accumulation rate is very worrisome. And they borrow now $4 for every dollar of GDP growth that they get. And just 5 years ago, they got $1 for $1. So there are, signs that they are leveraging themselves in a dangerous way to try to sustain that magic 7% number on the growth sort of front. And so I do worry about China and the global economy more because of their weakness rather than because of their strength.
Thank you.
Can I ask the last question, or is there? Can we just on the domestic scene, Tom? We're facing the 2014 midterm elections, at which point we will sort of officially have a lame duck administration with a president in facing the end of his second term. Will that status as a lame duck president, you think, play any role in the short term, as presidents sometimes think about their legacies, or is the situation in Washington such that that's not relevant?
I think it is an issue, but more domestically than internationally, because presidents have the most power in their first election, and they have a little bit of a boost after they're re-elected, and then it does sort of ebb away, especially after the midterms if they lose in the final midterms, which usually they do. There's only a couple, I think, of exceptions. But internationally, that's one of the reasons they turn to foreign policy, because they can be still very active. The President of the United States is never a lame duck in world politics, because the US is such an important sort of player. And so I think there's still a sort of vital role to play on that. There are some ways in which, for the president, if Republicans won, it may even help his international agenda a little bit. I think on trade, that's the biggest one, that it may be more possible to get TPP and then the Transatlantic Investment Partnership, the TTIP, through. But that remains to be seen. Hopefully it will go through this year, the first of them.
Great. Thank you. We'll have time for questions as we're leaving, but I always try and get people out on time who make the effort to come here. So thank you again for coming. Next week, we'll have a Brookings colleague out. Adi Tomer will be out, and we'll turn to a domestic issue. We'll be talking about transportation policy, both in the US, but he will have some interesting observations on Las Vegas. Specifically here at Brookings Mountain West, we've looked at some of the infrastructure issues. You may be familiar with the interest in building Interstate 11, the connection to Phoenix, the talk about constructing light rail to move both our workforce and ourselves, as well as our 40 million visitors in and around our city. So we'll have a domestic topic next week on Wednesday, but I invite you back then. And also in a few weeks, we'll have Tom's colleague Bruce Jones out. They work closely together, but have some different views on some of these issues. So come back and see if Tom is right. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you again, and thank you for coming out this evening.